A janitor at my Christmas table? That's the best you could do after all these years, Margaret, my ex-husband said with a laugh that carried across the dining room. My children laughed with him. The man they were laughing at simply folded his napkin and slowly rose from his chair. What happened next changed the way my family saw him forever. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Christmas had always been my favorite holiday. Even after the divorce, even after the years of awkward family gatherings and carefully chosen words, I still believed the season could bring people together. Maybe that was my flaw. At 67 years old, I still wanted to believe people could be kinder than they really were. That evening, snow rested lightly on the rooftops outside my daughter Rachel's home. The neighborhood looked like something from a Christmas card. Warm lights glowed through windows. Wreaths hung from front doors. The scent of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh baked rolls greeted us the moment Daniel and I stepped inside. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope. Daniel stood beside me carrying a small pie he'd baked himself. He wore a navy sweater and pressed slacks. Nothing fancy. Daniel never cared much about appearances. He simply believed in showing respect wherever he went. "You look nervous," he whispered as he squeezed my hand. "I'm not nervous," I lied. He smiled gently. "You've been fixing your necklace every 30 seconds. I laughed despite myself. That was one of the things I loved most about him. He always noticed the little things, the things nobody else seemed to see anymore. Rachel greeted us at the door with a quick hug. My son Ethan waved from across the living room. His wife Vanessa barely looked up from her phone. None of it surprised me. For nearly 3 years, my children had made it clear they didn't approve of my relationship with Daniel. They never said it directly at first. Instead, they asked careful questions. Questions that sounded polite, but carried judgment underneath. What does he do? Where did you meet him? Are you sure he's not interested in your retirement savings? Then, eventually the questions stopped being polite. Daniel worked as a janitor at the middle school across town. He'd spent more than 20 years keeping hallways clean, repairing broken lockers, and helping teachers with whatever they needed. To me, it was honest work. To my children, it wasn't impressive enough. To my ex-husband Richard, it was ammunition. The evening moved along with forced smiles and strained conversation. Christmas music played softly in the background. Glasses clinked. Plates were filled. I kept hoping things would settle into something normal. Maybe Richard would behave himself for one night. Maybe my children would see the man I saw every day. The man who brought soup when I was sick. The man who remembered every birthday. The man who treated strangers with the same kindness he offered friends. But some people arrive at dinner already knowing exactly who they intend to humiliate. We were halfway through the meal when Richard leaned back in his chair and stared directly at Daniel. The room quieted almost immediately. I recognized that expression. I'd seen it many times during our marriage. It was the look he wore right before saying something cruel disguised as humor. "So, Daniel," Richard said loudly, lifting his wine glass, "tell me something. How does it feel spending Christmas with people whose houses you're usually cleaning?" A few nervous chuckles followed. My stomach tightened. Daniel remained calm. "Feels pretty much the same as spending Christmas with anyone else," he answered politely. Richard smirked. Ethan laughed. Vanessa shook her head. Then Richard delivered the comment that silenced me completely. "Well, I suppose trash has to end up somewhere. Even at Christmas dinner." My children laughed. Not loudly. Not cruelly enough to make headlines. But enough. Enough for me to feel my heart sink. Enough to remind me exactly where I stood in my own family. I looked at Daniel, expecting pain, embarrassment, maybe even anger. Instead, he calmly folded his napkin, placed it beside his plate, and slowly stood up. And for the first time all evening, every person in the room stopped laughing. The silence settled over the dining room so quickly that even the Christmas music seemed distant. Daniel stood calmly beside his chair, one hand resting lightly on the table. He did not look angry. He did not look embarrassed. If anything, he looked disappointed. Richard shifted slightly in his seat, as though he expected an argument. Ethan's smile faded. Rachel stared down at her plate. Vanessa suddenly became very interested in adjusting her napkin. I sat frozen, my hands folded tightly in my lap. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel offered a small smile and said, "You know, it is funny. People spend a lot of time deciding which jobs deserve respect." His voice was steady and warm, not defensive, not bitter, just calm. Richard let out a short laugh. "Come on, Daniel. Do not take it personally. We are all just having a little fun." Daniel nodded. "I understand." He glanced around the room before gently pulling his chair back into place and sitting down again. That surprised everyone. I think they had expected him to storm out or argue. Instead, he simply picked up his fork and continued eating. The conversation slowly restarted, but something had changed. The laughter never fully returned. People spoke in shorter sentences. Eye contact became rare. Even Richard seemed less comfortable than before. I looked at Daniel and felt the familiar ache in my chest. Not because of what had happened tonight, but because I knew how often people underestimated him. They saw his uniform. They saw the school keys hanging from his belt. They saw the title printed on employment forms. They never saw the man underneath. That had been true when I first met him as well. 3 years earlier, my life looked very different. My divorce from Richard had already been finalized. Ethan and Rachel had built families of their own. Holidays had become obligations instead of celebrations. Most evenings, I ate dinner alone in a small house that felt much larger than it really was. I told everyone I enjoyed the quiet. The truth was less impressive. I had simply grown accustomed to loneliness. Every morning, I walked 2 miles around the local middle school track for exercise. The school sat just a few blocks from my neighborhood. It was peaceful there before classes started. One rainy October morning, I slipped on a patch of wet pavement near the parking lot. It was not a dramatic fall, but it was enough to leave me sitting on the ground feeling embarrassed and foolish. Before I could stand, someone appeared beside me holding an umbrella. "Take your time," he said. "Nothing is worth rushing with a sore knee." That was Daniel. He helped me to a nearby bench and stayed until he was sure I was all right. The next morning he waved when he saw me walking. The morning after that, he remembered my name. A week later, he asked about my knee. Small things. Ordinary things. But after years of feeling invisible, those small things mattered more than I could explain. Over time, our conversations became longer. We talked about books, gardening, old movies, Christmas traditions. We talked about life after disappointment. Neither of us was trying to impress the other. There were no games, no grand promises, just kindness, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. By the following spring, I realized something surprising. Daniel knew more about my daily life than my own children did. He remembered appointments. He noticed when I seemed tired. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He made me feel seen. Looking around that Christmas table now, I wondered how people who claimed to love me could not recognize that gift. Across the room, Daniel caught my eye and gave me the same reassuring smile he had offered on the day we met. Then he glanced toward Ethan for a brief second. Something in his expression changed. Not anger, recognition. And in that moment, I had the strange feeling that Daniel knew something about my son that the rest of us did not. The rest of the meal continued under a strange cloud of tension. Forks scraped against plates. Glasses clinked softly. Outside, snow drifted past the windows in slow white sheets, covering the neighborhood in a peaceful silence that felt completely disconnected from the room around us. Richard eventually resumed talking, filling the silence with stories about golf tournaments and investment properties, but fewer people seemed interested now. Every few minutes, I caught Ethan glancing toward Daniel. At first, I thought it was guilt. Then I realized it looked more like confusion. Daniel remained his usual self. He thanked Rachel for dinner. He complimented the sweet potatoes. He asked Vanessa about her new marketing project. The remarkable thing was not that he stayed calm. The remarkable thing was that he treated everyone with kindness even after they had shown him so little. I wondered if I could have done the same. After dessert was served, Rachel disappeared into the kitchen to refill coffee cups. Ethan followed a few minutes later. Through the doorway, I could see them talking quietly. Rachel appeared concerned. Ethan looked distracted. When they returned, neither of them said much. Daniel noticed it too. I could tell by the thoughtful expression that crossed his face. Several times he seemed about to speak before deciding against it. It reminded me of something he often did whenever he was carrying a difficult memory. Daniel was not a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. He preferred listening to talking, watching to judging, helping to receiving credit. That was one reason I trusted him. In a world full of people eager to tell you how important they were, Daniel never felt the need to announce his value. As the evening wore on, my thoughts drifted back to the months after we started dating. Those had not been easy days. Ethan had invited me to lunch shortly after learning about Daniel. At first I thought he wanted to get to know him. Instead, he spent most of the meal asking questions that sounded more like an investigation. How much money does he make? Does he own property? What are his retirement plans? Does he have debt? I remember setting down my coffee cup and asking why any of that mattered. Ethan had sighed and rubbed his forehead. Then he said something that stayed with me for months. Mom, people are not always who they seem. At the time I assumed he was trying to protect me. Looking back now, I think he was speaking from his own fears. Maybe he believed success could only be measured through salaries and titles. Maybe he had forgotten some of the lessons Richard spent years teaching him. Or perhaps he simply never learned different ones. Across the table, Daniel suddenly set down his coffee cup and looked directly at Ethan. How old is Tyler now? He asked. Ethan blinked. My son. Daniel nodded. 10, right? Ethan looked surprised. Yes. He turned 10 in October. Daniel smiled. That is a great age. Something about the exchange caught my attention immediately. Ethan seemed puzzled. Have you met Tyler before? He asked. Daniel paused for half a second. Not exactly. The answer only deepened the confusion. Ethan frowned slightly, but let the conversation move on. I noticed Rachel studying Daniel now too. She looked as though she was trying to remember something. A face. A voice. A detail hiding just beyond reach. The feeling spread quietly through the room. One by one, people seemed to realize there was more to Daniel than they had assumed. Even Richard became unusually quiet. Then Daniel folded his hands together and looked down for a moment. When he raised his eyes again, they settled on Ethan. There is something I have been meaning to tell you for a very long time, he said softly. The room became completely still. And for the second time that evening, every person at the table stopped what they were doing. No one moved. Even the faint sound of holiday music from the living room seemed to disappear. Daniel was not a man who demanded attention, which was exactly why everyone listened when he finally chose to speak. Ethan shifted in his chair and forced a small smile. Something you wanted to tell me? He asked. Daniel nodded. Actually, something I should have told you years ago. Rachel exchanged a glance with Vanessa. Richard leaned back with his arms crossed, clearly expecting some dramatic speech. Instead, Daniel spoke quietly. About 11 years ago, there was a winter storm. Heavy snow. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees that night. Ethan frowned. I remember a lot of winter storms. Daniel smiled slightly. This one happened near Lincoln Elementary. Something changed in Ethan's expression. It was subtle, just a flicker. Daniel continued. School had ended. Early because of the weather. Most of the staff left. I was still working when I noticed a boy alone near the back parking lot. Ethan stared at him. Nobody interrupted. The buses had already gone. The roads were getting worse. That boy was scared, but trying not to show it. Daniel paused. He kept saying his father was coming. Rachel slowly lowered her coffee cup. Ethan, she whispered. Ethan said nothing. Daniel continued speaking with the same calm tone. I stayed with him for nearly 3 hours. We sat inside the maintenance office because it was warm. I found a board game in a storage closet. We played while we waited. Ethan blinked several times. That was you, he asked quietly. Daniel nodded. For the first time all evening, there was no tension in his face. Only kindness. Your father eventually arrived. He was frustrated. Traffic was terrible. He thanked me and took you home. The room remained silent. Ethan looked down at the table. I could almost see the memory returning. Daniel smiled. You talked about becoming an astronaut that day. Rachel suddenly laughed softly through her surprise. You did want to be an astronaut. Ethan ignored her. His eyes never left Daniel. I remember that man, he said. I remember him giving me hot chocolate. Daniel nodded again. That was me. Richard cleared his throat. That was a long time ago. Daniel looked toward him politely.
Yes, it was.
Then he returned his attention to Ethan. You were a good kid. Something in those words seemed to affect my son more than anyone expected. Ethan lowered his eyes again. The confidence he carried so easily throughout most of his adult life seemed to shrink a little. Daniel was not finished. The reason I never mentioned it is because it never seemed important. He folded his hands together. Helping a child stay safe during a snowstorm should not be considered extraordinary. It is simply what decent people do. Nobody spoke. Daniel glanced around the table. That is something I learned from the people who worked around me growing up. Mechanics, custodians, bus drivers, secretaries, people whose names are often forgotten. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's voice remained gentle. Some jobs are more visible than others, but dignity does not come from a job title. Rachel stared at the tablecloth. Vanessa suddenly looked embarrassed. Ethan seemed unable to look anywhere except at Daniel. I sat quietly, feeling something unexpected.
Pride.
Not because Daniel had revealed some secret achievement. Not because he had proven anyone wrong, but because he had handled cruelty with grace. Most people would have defended themselves. Daniel simply reminded everyone what character looked like. Ethan finally spoke. His voice was softer than I had heard in years. Why did you never tell me? Daniel smiled. Because I did not think you needed to remember me. Then he added, I only hoped you would remember the lesson. Ethan swallowed hard. The room fell silent once more. But this silence felt different. Earlier, it had been uncomfortable. Now it felt reflective, heavy with realization. And when I looked across the table at my children, I began to suspect that Christmas dinner was no longer unfolding the way Richard had planned. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking each passing second with a soft tick. Ethan stared at Daniel as though he were seeing him for the first time. Rachel looked down at her hands. Vanessa avoided eye contact entirely. Richard remained silent, but I knew him well enough to recognize discomfort when I saw it. He had spent most of his life believing he could control the direction of every conversation. Tonight, that control was slowly slipping away. Daniel reached for his coffee cup and took a small sip. He did not look victorious. He did not seem interested in proving anyone wrong. That made his quiet dignity even more powerful. I remember that day clearly, Ethan finally said. His voice sounded distant. I was terrified. Daniel nodded. Most children would have been. Ethan let out a slow breath. I never forgot the hot chocolate. A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face. It came from an old vending machine. I was never sure it tasted very good. Rachel laughed softly. The sound surprised everyone, including herself. For the first time all evening, the tension eased slightly. Then Rachel looked toward me. Her expression changed. There was guilt there. The kind that arrives when someone finally notices a truth that has been standing in front of them for years. Mom, she said quietly, why did you never tell us any of this? I looked at her for a moment before answering. Because it was never my story to tell. Rachel lowered her eyes. I could see her thinking. Not just about Daniel.
About me.
About the past several years. The missed phone calls. The holidays shortened by excuses. The family gatherings where I had slowly become an afterthought. Sometimes people do not realize how much they have taken for granted until they see someone else offering what they themselves failed to give. Vanessa cleared her throat. Daniel, I think we may have judged you unfairly. Daniel smiled politely. Everyone makes assumptions. I have done it myself. His answer somehow made the apology feel even smaller. Ethan leaned forward.
No.
This is different. He looked genuinely troubled now. I laughed earlier. Daniel said nothing. Ethan rubbed his forehead. I should not have. Across the table, Richard finally spoke. Let us not turn this into a dramatic family intervention. His tone carried a trace of irritation. The room immediately grew quiet again. Ethan looked at his father. Rachel looked at him too. Something had shifted between them. For years, Richard's opinions had guided nearly every family conversation. Tonight, his words no longer carried the same weight. Daniel remained calm. "Nobody is turning it into anything," he said. "We are simply talking." Richard forced a smile. "You seem very comfortable giving life lessons." Daniel shook his head gently. "Not life lessons. Observations." Then he glanced toward the framed family photographs displayed on a nearby shelf. "Families are interesting. Most people think respect is something earned through success. I have learned it is usually revealed through how we treat people who cannot offer us anything in return." Nobody challenged him. Nobody laughed. Rachel looked away first. Ethan followed a few seconds later. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest, but it was different from the sadness I had carried into the house earlier that evening. This feeling came from watching painful truths finally reach the surface. Daniel had not exposed anyone. He had not embarrassed anyone. He had simply held up a mirror. And some people were beginning to recognize their own reflection. Then Ethan suddenly looked back at Daniel. His expression sharpened with a new realization. "Wait," he said slowly. "You said that was not the only time we crossed paths." Daniel set down his cup. For the first time all evening, a serious look entered his eyes. He glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to Ethan. "No," he said quietly. "It was not." The room became still once again, and something told me the next part of the story would be impossible for any of us to ignore. Daniel remained quiet for a moment. No one rushed him. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the dining room windows, covering the street in a blanket of white. The house felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as though every person at the table had been pulled into the same memory and was waiting to discover where it would lead. Ethan leaned forward. "What do you mean it was not the only time?" Daniel folded his hands together. "About 6 years after the snowstorm, I saw you again." Ethan frowned. "Where?" "At Riverside Community Center." Ethan stared at him. Rachel looked confused. Vanessa glanced between them. Then Ethan's expression slowly changed. "The summer after Tyler was born?" Daniel nodded. "That is right." Ethan sat back in his chair. I could tell he was searching through old memories. Daniel continued. "You were volunteering there on Saturdays for a few months." Rachel blinked in surprise. "You volunteered?" Ethan gave a small shrug. "For a little while." Daniel smiled. "Long enough to make a difference." Richard remained silent. His earlier confidence had faded noticeably. Daniel was not exposing anyone. He was simply telling the truth. Somehow that felt more powerful. "There was a man named Walter," Daniel said. "He came to the center every week." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "Walter." Daniel nodded. "He was 82, lived alone, loved baseball."
A
faint smile appeared on Ethan's face. "I remember him." "Most people ignored him," Daniel said. "They were polite, but they were busy." Walter talked slowly. He repeated stories. He needed help carrying things. Ethan lowered his eyes. "He reminded me of Grandpa." "Exactly," Daniel replied. "Every Saturday you sat with him. You listened to the same stories. You carried his groceries to his car. You treated him like he mattered." Nobody spoke. Daniel looked directly at Ethan. "That is the young man I remembered when Margaret first told me about her son." Ethan swallowed hard. Rachel stared at her brother. I could almost see the conflict forming inside him. The memory Daniel described did not match the version of himself sitting at the table tonight. Daniel continued softly. "The reason I recognized you was not because of your face. People change. It was because of the way you spoke to Walter. Very few people show that kind of patience." Ethan looked down at his plate. "I have not thought about him in years." "I have," Daniel said, "because people rarely realize the impact they have on others." The room fell silent again. Daniel glanced around the table before continuing. "When Margaret and I started spending time together, she often talked about her children. She talked about their accomplishments, their families, their careers. She was proud of all of you." I felt my throat tighten. Daniel smiled at me briefly before looking back at Ethan and Rachel. But sometimes she sounded lonely. Rachel closed her eyes for a second. Vanessa stared at the tablecloth. No one interrupted. Daniel's voice remained calm. I remember wondering how the young man who sat with Walter every Saturday could become too busy to call his mother for weeks at a time. Ethan looked as though the words had landed directly in his chest. Daniel was not accusing him. That somehow made it harder to dismiss. Richard shifted uncomfortably. People get busy, he said. Daniel nodded. They do. Then he added gently, but the people who love us do not stop needing us simply because we become busy. Rachel wiped at the corner of one eye. Ethan remained motionless. For years, I had tried to explain my loneliness without sounding needy. I had tried to hide disappointment behind understanding. Somehow Daniel had expressed it in one sentence better than I ever could. Then Ethan finally looked up. His voice was barely above a whisper. Mom, how many times did I do that? I looked at my son and saw something I had not seen in a very long time. Not defensiveness. Not obligation. Regret. And before I could answer, Rachel suddenly spoke. More than just Ethan. Every head at the table turned toward her. Rachel let out a slow breath and looked directly at me. He is right, she said quietly. It was not just Ethan. Her voice trembled slightly. I did it too. The room remained silent. Nobody rushed to fill the space. Rachel folded her hands together and stared at them for a moment before continuing. I kept telling myself I was busy. The kids had activities. Work was stressful. Life was complicated. She gave a sad smile. But somehow I always had time for everything except the things that mattered most. I felt something tighten in my chest. Rachel had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who avoided conflict whenever possible. Hearing her speak so openly surprised me. Vanessa looked down at the table. Ethan remained completely still. Rachel glanced toward Daniel. You know what bothers me? She asked. Daniel shook his head gently. What? Rachel swallowed hard. Mom never complained. That simple sentence seemed to affect everyone, including me. Rachel looked around the table. She never demanded attention. She never made us feel guilty. She never asked for anything. Her eyes became glossy. She just kept showing up. I stared at my daughter, unable to speak. Memories surfaced one after another. Birthday parties, school events, holiday dinners, last-minute invitations. Long drives through bad weather just to spend an hour with family. Rachel continued. There were times when I canceled plans with Mom because something else came up. And every single time she said she understood. Her voice softened. I thought understanding meant it did not hurt. No one argued. No one could. Daniel sat quietly, allowing the truth to unfold on its own. Richard shifted in his chair again. He looked increasingly uncomfortable. For years, the family dynamic had revolved around certainty. Richard spoke. Everyone listened. Richard judged. Everyone followed. Tonight, that pattern was breaking apart piece by piece. Ethan finally looked at me. Mom, did it hurt? The question sounded almost childlike. Not because it was simple, because it was honest. I looked at my son for a long moment. Sometimes, I answered. Ethan lowered his eyes. I continued softly. Not because I expected perfection. I know people have lives, families, responsibilities. I paused. It hurt because eventually I stopped feeling included in those lives. The room grew quiet again. Vanessa wiped at her eyes. Rachel reached for my hand across the table. I am sorry, she whispered. The sincerity in her voice nearly broke my heart. Not because I wanted an apology, because I realized how long we had all been carrying misunderstandings without talking about them. Daniel smiled gently. Families drift apart slowly, he said. Most of the time nobody notices until the distance becomes impossible to ignore. Ethan nodded. I think that is exactly what happened. Then something unexpected occurred. Tyler, who had been quietly playing a game on a tablet in the adjoining family room, wandered into the dining room. He looked around at all the serious faces and frowned. Why is everybody sad? He asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then Daniel smiled. "We are not sad." Tyler looked skeptical. "You kind of look sad." A few people laughed softly. Even Ethan managed to smile. Tyler climbed into a chair beside his father. "Grandma Margaret is my favorite," he announced matter-of-factly. "She always comes to my games." The room went silent again. Tyler looked confused by the reaction. "What?" he asked. Ethan stared at his son. Rachel looked away. I felt tears threatening for the first time all evening. Tyler had no idea what he had just done. Children rarely do. They simply tell the truth as they see it. Daniel smiled at the boy. Then he looked around the table. Sometimes the people who notice the most are the ones who have not learned how to ignore things yet. Nobody disagreed. And when I glanced toward Richard, I noticed something I had not expected to see all night. For the first time since dinner began, he was no longer looking at Daniel. He was staring down at his own plate. The atmosphere in the dining room felt completely different now. Earlier in the evening, people had been laughing at Daniel. Now nobody seemed interested in speaking at all. Tyler had already wandered back to the family room, unaware that his simple observation had exposed something the adults had spent years avoiding. I looked around the table and saw faces filled with reflection rather than judgment. Rachel kept holding my hand. Ethan stared quietly into his coffee cup. Vanessa sat with her shoulders lowered, as though a weight she had not noticed before had finally become visible. Only Richard remained apart from the rest of us. He sat silently, looking toward the window where snow continued drifting through the darkness. For the first time in a very long time, he seemed uncertain. Daniel never pushed the moment. That was another thing I admired about him. He never rushed people toward conclusions. He simply allowed truth enough room to breathe. After several minutes, Rachel stood and walked toward the kitchen. When she returned, she carried a large photo album. I recognized it immediately. It was one of the family albums I had put together years earlier. Rachel placed it gently on the table and opened it. The first pages showed school plays, birthday parties, soccer games, graduations, and family vacations. Everyone leaned closer. The photographs captured moments that felt both distant and immediate. Ethan pointed to one picture and laughed softly. "I forgot about that haircut." Rachel smiled. "Mom begged you not to do it." A few people chuckled. The laughter felt different this time. Warmer.
Kinder.
Then Rachel turned another page. There I was standing beside Ethan at his college graduation. Another page showed me helping Rachel move into her first apartment. Another showed me holding Tyler as a newborn. Page after page revealed the same pattern. I appeared in nearly every major moment of their lives. Not in the center. Not demanding attention. Just present. Supporting. Showing up. Vanessa slowly flipped through several more pages before stopping. Her expression changed. "There are hardly any pictures of you by yourself," she said quietly. I looked at the album. She was right. Most photographs showed me celebrating someone else. Helping someone else. Standing beside someone else. Daniel smiled gently. That happens sometimes with the people holding families together. They are so busy supporting everyone else that nobody notices they are missing from the picture. The words settled heavily over the table. Ethan closed the album carefully. "I think we stopped seeing Mom as a person," he said. Nobody argued. We just assumed she would always be there. Rachel nodded slowly. And because she never complained, we convinced ourselves everything was fine. I looked down at the worn cover of the album. There was no anger left inside me. Only sadness for the years we could not get back and gratitude for the chance to understand each other before it was too late. Then something unexpected happened. Richard finally spoke. His voice was quieter than I had heard all evening. "Margaret." Every person at the table looked toward him. He cleared his throat and stared at the album for a long moment. "I think I owe you an apology." The room became completely still. Ethan looked shocked. Rachel blinked several times. Even Daniel appeared surprised. Richard exhaled slowly. "Not just for tonight." He paused. "For a lot of things." Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Years of history seemed to hang in the air between us. I looked at the man I had once shared a life with and realized this was the first time in decades that he sounded truly honest. Then he lifted his eyes and looked directly at Daniel. And what he said next surprised everyone at the table. Richard looked directly at Daniel and took a slow breath before speaking. I was wrong about you. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed willing to break the moment. Richard glanced down at the table for a second before continuing. Not just tonight. From the beginning. Daniel remained quiet. Richard gave a small, humorless laugh. The truth is, I never bothered getting to know you. He shook his head. I saw your job title and decided I already knew everything that mattered. The admission hung in the air. For a man like Richard, those words could not have been easy. Daniel offered a small nod. We all make mistakes. Richard looked at him for a long moment. Some of us make the same mistake for years. Then he turned toward me. The confidence that had defined so much of our marriage seemed absent now. Margaret, I spent a long time assuming you would always be there no matter how little effort I made.
His voice softened.
I do not think I appreciated you nearly enough. I felt emotion rise unexpectedly in my chest. Not because I needed those words anymore. In some ways, that chapter of my life had already closed. But hearing them still mattered. Rachel reached over and squeezed my hand. Ethan looked down, clearly fighting his own emotions. Vanessa quietly wiped away a tear. Daniel sat beside me with the same calm presence he had carried all evening. He never looked triumphant. That was what separated him from so many people. He did not need to win. He simply wanted people to understand each other. Ethan finally stood from his chair. He walked around the table and stopped beside me. For a second, he looked like the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard. Mom, he said softly, I am sorry for every call I never made. Every visit I postponed. Every time I assumed there would always be another chance. His voice broke slightly. You deserved better from me. I stood and wrapped my arms around him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rachel joined us a second later. Then Vanessa. The years of distance did not disappear instantly. Real life does not work that way. But something important changed that night. The walls we had built finally began to come down. After a while, Tyler wandered back into the room carrying a plate of cookies. He looked at the group hug and smiled. Did everybody stop being weird? He asked. Laughter filled the room. Genuine laughter this time. Warm laughter. The kind that heals instead of hurts. Even Richard laughed. The tension that had dominated the evening finally disappeared. Later, that night, after dessert plates were cleared away and gifts were exchanged, Daniel and I prepared to leave. Snow still covered the sidewalks outside. The neighborhood lights reflected off the white ground, making everything glow softly. As Daniel helped me into my coat, Ethan approached him near the front door. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ethan extended his hand. Daniel shook it. Thank you, Ethan said quietly. Daniel smiled. For what? Ethan glanced toward the dining room where the rest of the family was talking. For reminding me who I used to be. Daniel's expression softened. You are still that person. Ethan nodded slowly. I could tell those words meant more to him than any lecture ever could. A few minutes later, Daniel and I stepped outside into the cold night air. Snow crunched beneath our shoes as we walked toward the car. I looked back once through the front window. Inside, my family stood together talking and laughing. Not perfectly, not magically transformed.
Just trying again.
Daniel squeezed my hand. You okay? He asked. I smiled. Yes. And for the first time in a very long while, I truly meant it. As we drove home through the quiet streets, I thought about everything that had happened that evening. The insults, the laughter, the uncomfortable truths, the apologies. In the end, the man some people had dismissed because of his job had accomplished something none of them expected. He did not shame anyone. He did not seek revenge. He simply reminded an entire family that a person's worth is measured by character, kindness, and the way they treat others. And as I looked over at Daniel behind the wheel, I realized something beautiful. The greatest gift I received that Christmas was not an apology. It was knowing that the man sitting beside me had never once needed anyone's approval to prove his value.